the United States basically at every step kept saying to the Russian leadership, you don't count for anything. We don't have to listen to you about anything. And eventually, all of the goodwill dissipated. Basically, this is a war of NATO enlargement because Ukraine is the borderland. It's the word Ukraine. It means the border. It's the borderland between East and West in countless ways. It's the border between Catholic and Protestant on the one side versus Orthodox on the other side. It's the border between the Russian Empire and the Austrian and Polish, Lithuanian, and German states on the other side. It's always been the divide. The Dnieper River is the divide, basically. And so this is a difficult place that needs to be handled with care. But the United States took the view that Ukraine is a prize for the West. And even though Ukraine itself was deeply divided ethnically, linguistically, religiously, historically, in public opinion, the United States kept wanting it all. So it kept pushing for Western control over NATO and saying that any Russian concern, whether it's economic links, military links, family links, linguistic links, ethnic links, those don't count for anything. Those are just the old bad Russian Empire. And the US blew off any Russian concerns about Ukraine, even though the United States is how many thousand miles away, and Russia, on the other hand, is the border of 2,000 kilometers. The US is extremely arrogant as well as ignorant about all of this. So basically, from the mid-1990s onward, the US plan was Ukraine is ours. And the real meaning of that was NATO, but together with the European Union membership. And those are seen as a package more and more because NATO and the European Union are almost the same thing in the strategist mentality. If they were really separate, the world would be different, but they're not. They're both headquartered in Brussels, and they're both the same package deal, basically. So the US kept intervening in Ukrainian internal affairs. It kept basically siding with Ukrainian nationalists. It kept pushing for NATO membership, and it did that in 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution. It did it then most disastrously in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, where Bush pushed for NATO enlargement to Ukraine, even though the Europeans told him how dangerous it is. But of course, the Europeans don't dare say in public what they say in private. So we don't have a true accounting of that, but I know it to be the case, and others know it too. And then the real fuse was lit or detonated even. The bomb was detonated with the overthrow of Yanukovych in 2014. Yanukovych, in my view, was trying a difficult balancing act, pulled on the one side by the US, pulled on the other side by Russia. He wanted neutrality. He was responding to both sides. Ukraine had big governance problems, big financial problems, and each side pulling at Ukraine. And eventually, in my interpretation, the US sided with the Russophobic Ukrainian nationalists to overthrow Yanukovych in February 2014. And I know some of the story, but we don't know the full story because other than Victoria Nuland being caught on tape, the US keeps quiet about its covert operations, but my view is the U.S. was deeply involved in the overthrow of Yanukovych, didn't lift a finger to help even to stabilize the situation. It just helped to install a Russophobic government. And then when violence broke out in the Donbass, and the evidence is really that was not Russia instigated, it was instigated by Ukrainian Russians, not by Russia. But when the demands in the Donbass for protection broke out, Russia pushed for the Minsk agreements, and Merkel and Hollande said, yes, we'll help guarantee them. And then the United States said, don't worry about it, just forget it. And the Ukrainians also said, forget it. So the US plan was, we'll arm Ukraine enough that it will become a fait accompli, that Ukraine will become a NATO country and a European Union country, and Russia won't be able to do anything about it. So I think they really believed, what can Russia do? You know, it's a backwater, it's weak. We don't believe Putin's threats. If he actually does something, we'll sanction the economy to death. So they were playing a game of chicken, and Putin called their bluff and invaded in February after the U.S. refused to negotiate anything. And interestingly, almost days after, Zelensky said, oh, we should negotiate. And the Russians and the Ukrainians actually sat down and negotiated in Ankara and almost reached an agreement. And then the United States intervened, said, you don't have to reach an agreement. We're going to crush Russia. And you're going to do it for us, Ukraine. You're going to be heroes. You're going to defeat Russia with our wonderful weapons and our economic sanctions. And of course, this was an illusion, typical American arrogance, because Putin mobilized in the middle of 2022. And also, Russia was a far more capable military and far more capable arms manufacturer than the United States allowed, and technologically much more sophisticated than they imagined, with very smart guided missiles and a lot of advanced digital technologies. And so Putin escalated. And now we can see, we don't know the outcome of this, but of course, Ukraine is being bloodied tragically. Probably, you know, it's said 40,000 dead in the last 2 months. I don't know whether those estimates are accurate or not, but you can see the West doesn't care at all about the loss of life in Ukraine. It just says, here, have some more weapons and go to it. Keep going. And no matter how big the bloodshed, the U.S. view is, well, they're the ones dying. We're not dying. It's our weapons. And we're selling a lot, and our companies like it. So this is a bluff that was called, a kind of game of chicken, and Russia showed that it could keep escalating, and the West has no plan because it thought it could get away with things. Going back to February 2014, the idea was, we'll put in a new government and Ukraine will join the West. That's it. And then Putin grabbed Crimea, as he had threatened to do. Oh, that's a surprise. And then the Minsk, oh, that's a surprise. So the West keeps getting surprised. And Biden has been there all along, playing an important role in this. And I think he's just a very bad strategist. And he's put Ukraine into a terrible, terrible disaster. And my expression at the beginning of this war was that the U.S. is going to make Ukraine into a European Afghanistan, because the U.S. wrecked Afghanistan for 40 years, destroyed that country mercilessly, cynically, ignorantly, brutally. And they're going to do the same with Ukraine unless the Ukrainians wake up and say, God, we're being killed by this approach, which is what they should have woken up about a long time ago. And I'll tell you, by the way, the ultimate issue in Africa, although part of it is still getting, ending the French colonial era in these countries, but the real issue in these countries in the Sahel is they're the poorest place in the world, and nobody in Europe or the US gives a damn. That's the real story here. Because I've been to these countries for years and years. The impoverishment is intense. And if you go back and say to the US or Europe, this is really important that you do something about the poverty, they laugh at you. Why should we care about the Sahel? Are you kidding? This is the biggest backwater of the whole planet, they'll tell you. And then they find out situation's not too happy there. But this is really an example of the unbelievable disdain that the rich world has for the poor world. Because these wars are basically, this war in Niger is basically a war of impoverishment because they have nothing there. And that I've seen all over the place. Yemen was another example where when I went, I was shocked at the poverty and at the threat of instability in 2009. And I went back to Washington and I was laughed at. What's the matter with you? Why do you care about such a stupid, hopeless place? Is the reception that I got. It's the same thing with Niger or Burkina Faso or Mali. So these are kind of deep, deep crises that reflect a world powers that don't give a damn. I'm talking about the Western powers.